Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt DiCamillo, the curator of fine art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Founded in 1670, Edinburgh's Royal Botanic Garden is one of the oldest surviving botanical gardens in the world, housing 273 individual plants and over 3 million specimens. The garden is known not only for its wonderful collection of plants, but also for its architecture, creative programs, scientific studies, and archives. Today's illustration-rich webinar will feature some of the most interesting stories of the history of this exceptional garden and offer insight into how the garden's mission to explore, conserve, and explain the world of plants is realized in practical terms today. I would like to thank the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation for their generous sponsorship of the Art and Architecture webinar series. Sadie Barber, manager of collections and research at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, has been working in horticulture for 20 years. Her expertise ranges from glasshouse horticulture to project management and plant collecting in the wild. Please join me in welcoming Sadie.
Thank you so much, Curt, and thank you to everybody for joining today. Now, I should say, just before I begin, that despite the title of the talk, my expertise is more horticultural than anything to do with stonemasonry or creatures from the ocean. But before I get into what the Royal Botanic Garden has to do with sandstone and the blue whale, I want to show you a short introduction video so you can get a taste of the garden that I've been lucky to call my office for the last 18 years. The garden's mission is to explore, conserve, and explain the world of plants. And we've been doing that now for 354 years. I'm going to take you through some key moments of our history. So here, to start, find our bearings and placemakers throughout the existence of the garden. This is a map of the city of Edinburgh. So starting way back in 1103, we've got Edinburgh Castle. Some of you may have visited, and perched right up on a volcanic hill overlooking the city surrounding it. And to the west of that is Craigleith Quarry, starting the story of the sandstone. And this features a few times in the story. So they started operating here a few decades before our garden was founded. the quarry opened in 1615. So it was actually running for 5 whole years before the Mayflower even dropped its anchor off the coast of Massachusetts. Now, going chronologically, the Edinburgh Botanic Garden has been on 4 different sites, starting with the earliest in 1670 on the grounds of Holyrood Palace. Just a few years later, in 1676, it moves to a larger site at what was then Trinity Hospital, now Waverley train station. Next, in 1763, the garden expands to a larger site in Leith, and back then it was just a greenfield site. The last move is where we are now, and that was in 1820. So this is Inverleith, which is a kind of residential area characterized by green spaces and large detached houses from the Victorian and Edwardian period. And while I've been chronological so far, I should tell you that I'm going to be bouncing around the timeline somewhat, a little bit non-linear. So I'm going to start at the beginning with Craigleith Quarry. This is an etching of that quarry. As I said, opened in 1615, and it produced much of the sandstone that built Edinburgh. It was known to have the best quality and most durable sandstone, and it was used for the fronts of houses and public buildings because it could be polished to a smooth surface. And the stone was actually exported to London, Europe, and the US. Some of the quarry's connection to the Botanic Garden is recorded, but some of it is not. And in the early years, around 1619, there is about 200 arch stones that were known to be transported to Edinburgh Castle using the king's horses. This whole facade of the main public entrance to the castle is made from Craigleith stone, including those arch stones I just mentioned, seen around the door. The stone was also used to build Holyrood Palace, which still stands today as the official residence in Scotland for the British monarch, now King Charles III. So I'm going to show you some evidence that points to one of our iconic buildings or its connection to the quarry. And I want to see along the way if you're going to agree with my deduction. Now, moving along the timeline, this is an etching of Edinburgh for 1647, so still prior to when we were actually founded. And Edinburgh had just come through 2 years of the plague, which devastated the city, killing 50% of its population. You can see how tightly packed the housing is, and there's certainly no good sanitation in the city at that time. So the plague spread pretty fast. And I'm sure you'll know already that in the 17th century, the treatment for sickness was herbal medicine. And this is where the story of the Botanic Garden really begins. The Palace of Holyrood did have some formal gardens, which you see around the palace on this part of the same etching from 1647. But it wasn't until 2 doctors came together in 1670 that Edinburgh's first botanical garden was founded. The founders were physicians Andrew Balfour and here Robert Sibbald. Interesting that we don't have an image of Andrew Balfour, and which perhaps indicates that he didn't really play as big a role in this whole enterprise or in society in general. So we're going to stick with Robert Sibbald. Now, an article written about Sibbald in 1976 notes that he was a man with a notable record. So I quote, "To make a single contribution in a single science is the hope of every researcher, but to make substantial advances in several scientists is beyond the scope of all but a few in any generation." And Sibbald's first achievement was outstanding and enduring in that he established the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And it's enduring indeed, because here we are 354 years later. The garden itself on the grounds of Holyrood Palace was no bigger than a tennis court. It was home to various medicinal plants such as primrose, used as salves for wounds, or hellebores used to help skin infections and arthritis. My favorite, the Madonna lily, said to, I quote, "cleareth ye faces and make them without wrinkles." I'm going to look that one up. So just 6 years later, in 1676, the garden outgrew its space and moved to a site on the grounds of Trinity Hospital. This site, while quite a bit larger than the Holyrood one, lay perilously close to the Nor Loch, which you can see at the foot of Edinburgh Castle Rock in this image. Now, I say perilous because in 1689, there was a siege on Edinburgh Castle by Scottish rebels trying to overthrow the English king. The attempt was unsuccessful, but in the process, the rebels broke the dam of the loch and flooded the garden, almost destroying it. And this is where our next hero comes in. The keeper of the garden in these early years was a man called James Sutherland, and he never tired in his efforts to restore the garden. James Sutherland is another one of the important historic figures that we don't have an image of, but we do have a very significant artifact. This is an original book from 1683, held in our archives at the garden. It was produced by Sutherland, and it lists around 2,000 plants that the Physic Garden had in its catalogue at the time. So we wouldn't recognize some of the names in this book, as it predates the scientific binomial naming system that was introduced about 70 years later by a Swedish scientist who we'll meet soon. Some of the plants in the catalogue and in Robert Sibbald's similar book a year later, Scotia Illustrata, didn't have any formal name because it predated the binomial system. But instead, they had sort of a loose description with a title such as this one. Fragaria affinis planta non scripta, as it was named in the book, is an unnamed species like strawberry. This is a significant plant because it would later become the logo, as you see here, of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. And it's now known as Sibbaldea procumbens, and it was given this name by none other than the father of taxonomy, Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus. Linnaeus himself, both a physician and a botanist, recognized Robert Sibbald's contribution to botany, and he named this strawberry-like plant after him. So with this, we now return to the subject of Robert Sibbald. Now, this painting shows the estuary of the Firth of Forth. So that's the estuary that lies north of the Edinburgh city. Now, along the banks of this estuary, Robert Sibbald, he was walking there in 1692, a little while after this was painted. It was there that he stumbled, stumbled may not be the right word, on a stranded blue whale, which had washed up on the shore. So he goes on to publish the first scientific description of the blue whale, and I'm going to read you a part of this wonderfully colourful description. This is Robert Sibbald's writing. In September 1692, on the southern shore of the estuary of the Forth, near the old castle of Abercorn, was thrown a male whale, 78 feet long, and which seemed to have a thickness proportionate to its length. The lower jaw was much broader and larger at the rear, and of semicircular shape, whence the head seemed blunt and rounder. The smile of this beast was so great that 14 men stood in its mouth at one and the same time. And when the tide came in, a boat entered its mouth full of men. So this drawing that Sibbald created himself was first published in his own book, Phalenologica Nova, as its name. Now, moving a few years ahead from the blue whale, in 1697, we are met with the oldest of our 3 million specimens in the herbarium of Edinburgh. That specimen is Mersini africana. It was collected at the Cape of Good Hope, or should I say Southern Cape. It's actually in South Africa. I think the Cape of Good Hope, maybe in South America. You can. I'll take corrections at the end. Anyway, I should qualify, as I said, that this is the oldest known specimen in Edinburgh, since we are finding and cataloguing some of our collection still to this day. And I know that only too well because I accidentally uncovered one of our other oldest specimens while researching for another talk I was giving. Now this one, it was just 2 years younger, I should say, than the earliest 1697 one. And it's of a plant that's now known as Echinacea purpurea. I think we all know Echinacea today as quite an effective medicinal plant, which I think is rather poetic that this was one that I found. It's also, so it links back to our kind of history as a medicinal garden, but it also, we think, pretty sure that it's our oldest of our American specimens in the herbarium. And not only that, once I was researching this, I've again fairly confident that this is the oldest specimen anywhere in the world of this particular species. Now, the date 1699 that you saw on that specimen is quite significant to the garden story for another reason. You remember James Sutherland. This was the first keeper of the garden who looked after the garden both at the Holyrood Palace and then later at the Trinity Hospital site. It was a big year for him, 1699. So he became a professor of botany at the University of Edinburgh, which would be big for anybody. But also King William, who was at the time resident at Holyrood Palace, asked James Sutherland to take on a special task of looking after what he called the King's Garden. And he was still leading the garden at Trinity, the now restored site after the flood. So the garden, I think because of James Sutherland's sort of tireless efforts and then becoming the King's botanist, was given the royal warrant for the garden. And so it's at that point in 1699 that we officially become the Royal Botanic Garden of Edinburgh. Now, he also, in that, becomes the Regius Keeper. So he was just the keeper. Now he is the King's botanist and the Regius Keeper. So the Regius Keeper is quite a unique title that is given to the head of the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And it still continues to this day. And this image here is of Simon Milne, our current and the 16th Regius Keeper of the garden, pictured alongside King Charles III. And our royal connections remain very strong. So King Charles is actually, we are privileged to say, the garden's own patron. And he's known to personally love the garden as well. He says himself that our garden is a garden which delights the eye, warms the heart, and feeds the soul, which is a very nice sort of nod to how much he enjoys it and loves the garden. And then continuing with the royal theme for a little moment, I just want to time travel now to modern day, or nearly modern day, to 2006 when we opened this memorial garden. And this was for Queen Elizabeth, who was still the monarch at the time, to remember her mother just after she passed. So the whole family now enjoy this quiet space. And you can see in this other image that it's full of plants that the Queen Mother enjoys. She was a lover of roses, for example. And it also features a pavilion, and the interior walls, if you ever get to visit, are clad with Scottish shells that have been collected by school children. Before I move on from this slide, just take a quick note of the structure in the background on the right, covered in white sheeting, but more of that later on. Across the city, another type of memorial site. This is Greyfriars Kirkyard, or cemetery. And this is some of where our garden's heroes are laid to rest. In 1719, sadly, James Sutherland dies, but he was the age of 80 in a time where life expectancy was just 38 years of age. This is a pretty remarkable lifespan. And a couple of years later, in 1722, Robert Sibbald dies and is also buried here. He was 81, and I'm pretty sure that their long lives had something to do with their love of plants, but then I am biased. And another notable figure from the Botanic Garden who's also buried here we haven't met him yet. And his name is Professor John Hope. So he was another one of our group of men who were both physicians and botanists. This is a kind of a common theme amongst the leaders of the garden throughout our whole history, that there's a sort of a dual nature to their profession and their skill. And this time we're now in the 1700s, so we've moved along a little on the timeline. And this is the next big change for the Botanic Garden. So during Professor John Hope, who was Regis Keeper as well, the garden moved to a different site. So this drawing shows a layout of a much bigger site in Leith, where we moved in 1763. So John Hope, leading the garden, was keen to make his mark on the new garden and employed landscape architect named Robert Robertson, and he himself was a collaborator of the very well-known Capability Brown. The Physic Gardens that we'd seen already, the Holyrood Palace and the Trinity Hospital one, had been ordered in a way that made them most useful for study and for medicine. So they had rows of plants, a bit similar to the layout you could see on the right-hand side of this image. But the rest of the garden, you can see, was much more kind of spread out, aesthetic, more of a pleasure garden, including a pond and vistas, and there's some greenhouses there as well. So those of you who do know Capability Brown's work, you might see that kind of influence on this design. Now, so if you just noted the previous slide there, you might have seen a kind of building on the southern perimeter of that new garden in Leith. So this is what was known as the Botanic Cottage, and it was designed by an acclaimed architect of the time and a friend of Professor Hope, and his name was John Adam. Upstairs in the cottage was a teaching room where Professor Hope himself taught botany to each and every student that was studying medicine at the University of Edinburgh at the time. So there again, we see that link between medicine and botany. So Hope was known to be a great teacher, and he also had some rather important students. In 1766, a certain Benjamin Rush travelled from the American colonies to attend Edinburgh University to study medicine. Edinburgh University was like a hub of great medicine studies. And Benjamin Rush was another one of these brilliant individuals who achieved great things in both medicine and politics and psychiatry. And this is one of Professor John Hope's own teaching books, one that he used while he taught Benjamin Rush at his time studying in the Botanic Cottage. And it's that we have a record that Rush did find the time very rewarding. The 2 years I spent in Edinburgh, he writes, I consider as the most important in their influence upon my character and conduct of any period in my life. Perhaps there is at present no spot upon the earth where religion, science, and literature combine to produce moral and intellectual pleasures, more so than in the metropolis of Scotland. So although it's known that Rush actually went on to reject most of his teachings of medicine in Scotland, and in fact, he rejected a lot of British things. When he returned home to America, he went on to become a very active revolutionary and fought the British, and in fact, is one of the 56 signatories to the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. So we skip ahead now to the 1800s and to the garden's next big move, this time to its current home in the area of Inverleith, to the north of the city. Now, for those who haven't been, when you do visit, take a walk up to the highest point of this garden and you will be rewarded with an amazing view of the city. Although I should say, as time goes on and the trees grow more, we end up with that view more and more obscured. But it's still a great view. It's always a window to see the castle. So when we moved here in 1820, we had to leave the historic Botanic cottage behind in Leith because there wasn't enough money. But other buildings were to come later on this site. And it's at this site that the Craigleith quarry folds back into the story. So just 10 years after we moved, in 1830, workers at the quarry unearthed a giant, almost entire tree fossil in amongst the stone. This is 330 million years old. And to this day, it's the largest in the UK, the largest plant fossil at 59 feet long. The tree fossil was gifted to the garden, and so it continues that long relationship between quarry and garden, and it's still able to be seen at the garden today. Roll on just 4 years, and we see a grand glass house built at the garden using iron and sandstone. The tropical palm house is an irregular octagon 60 foot wide and 50 foot tall, making it at the time the tallest in Europe. This later image shows the palm house, and actually at this point adjoined to the second one, which I'll tell you a little bit later on. And the older of the palm house in the foreground there, it's got sandstone pillars and mantle showing. Now, we have no written evidence to show where this sandstone actually came from, but given a few clues, I have reasonable confidence that it did come from Craigleith Quarry. So here are the clues, some of them. The cost of the greenhouse was £1,500, which was a very big price tag at the time, and suggests the use of high quality materials. Now, we know already that Craigleith Quarry, if you remember, was considered to have probably the best quality sandstone around. Another clue is the existing relationship between the two. The fossil tree had just been gifted only 4 years earlier. We also have to consider logistics. Surprisingly, Edinburgh didn't enjoy a rail system until later in 1842. So here we are, like 8 years before that, needing to move huge, heavy sandstone blocks around the city just by horse and cart. We do know that the quarry upgraded its tracks and roads into the city in 1834, same time that this was built. Coincidence, maybe, but the quarry being just 2 miles west of the garden, this would make the transport a whole lot easier. And there's just one other clue that comes much later, but for now we'll leave it as a pretty good guess that this wonderful octagonal building used the sandstone from Craigleith Quarry, which was the fabric of most of Edinburgh. So you would have seen that larger second palm house in the background of that image. Now this is the original plan of the second palm house. But we all know architects like to go big, but this really proved a bit too much. The architect of the second palm house, Robert Matheson, had to adjust the design, pull back a bit, and this building in its adjusted form started in 1856. Now, this time we do know the sandstone came from a Scottish quarry further afield, presumably because the design called for a lot of large blocks, and Craigleith's best quality stone was largely all used. This second palm house was completed in 1858, and it now stands as one of the most iconic structures in the garden, if not in the city of Edinburgh as a whole. Now we move a few years ahead again to the 1870s. Medicine students are still obliged to study botany at the garden at this time, and this is a class roll from 1877. Another notable student, if you can see about halfway down the page, the name Arthur Conan Doyle, Arthur C. Doyle. He was a native of Edinburgh, born in Edinburgh, and he was only 18 when he came to study medicine at the university. And of course, with that came to study botany as well at the garden. Now, of course, Arthur Conan Doyle is best known for his Sherlock Holmes stories, but he was also a qualified physician, a sportsman, a poet, a politician, again, And so another one of these like multi-talented individuals that pass through the gates of the Edinburgh Botanic Garden. There's also a wonderful quote I'd like to just read you from the very first of Sherlock Holmes's book, the Sherlock Holmes books called A Study in Scarlet. And this is where Dr. Watson is making an assessment of Sherlock Holmes. So the quote is, "Knowledge of botany variable, well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons in general. Knows nothing of practical gardening." Which I rather like. There's everything you can get from being an amazing scientist, but it's so damning if you don't know anything of practical gardening. And as a horticulturist myself, like, I think that's pretty damning. Now, the same year that Doyle studied at the garden and perhaps learns about the poisonous plants and the opium, the garden is gifted with this house, Inverleith House. It was formerly the residence of a wealthy landowner. And the house was part of a pocket of land with an arboretum that neighboured the Inverleith garden site. So the Regis Keeper at the time, who would have actually taught Arthur Conan Doyle himself, was offered this house to live in when it was gifted in 1877. This Regis Keeper's name was Professor John Hutton Balfour. He was another great teacher. He was also a stubborn man who fought at length with the trustees to get some extra coal or cash to buy coal to heat the large house. He went on to describe a new species of fungus that he'd found growing in his daughter's bedroom during one particularly bad spell of damp without the extra coal to heat and dry out the house. And he made this very clear to the trustees that this fungus was there and was bound to make the family extremely unhealthy. Okay, now we skipped several decades and a couple of wars and some world-changing inventions and discoveries by Scottish luminaries, I'd say, and zoom straight ahead to 1960. But we are staying with Inverleith House. It was in 1960 that this house became Edinburgh's first gallery of modern art, and to this day remains a great example of how gardens and art dovetail so beautifully. Over the years, there have been some remarkable artists on show, including William Eggleston, Carla Black, Andy Warhol, and Louise Bourgeois. And in fact, Louise Bourgeois enjoyed a stage with the former Regis Keeper John Hutton Balfour and his classroom drawings and diagrams. There are also sculptures in the garden. And here we see a piece called Rock Form by an English sculptor named Barbara Hepworth. She created this in 1963. Some of you might recognize this particular sculpture because it's one of 6 replicas cast in bronze. Another one of the 6 stands outside the Japanese garden at Boston's very own Museum of Fine Arts. And it is still there because I was there just last week and checked and took this photo. So this is Boston, but let's shoot back to Edinburgh. And one other piece of evidence. Actually, I do have 2 more pieces of evidence. So this is the first, right? This is just to basically show you my findings and the linking of the first Palm House to Craigleith Quarry. So when the quarry was finally closed down, all the good sandstone had gone. It was closed in 1995. The garden was given the very last of the quarried sandstone, which again, it sort of indicates like how close that relationship is. They gave us about 100 really nice big sort of pieces, and they were used to build a path on this part of the garden, which is called the Chinese Hillside, which leads actually quite nicely from a pavilion up to Inverleith House, where you get that amazing view of the city. So that's another piece of the puzzle, and that was 1995. Now, don't worry, I know this is like going back in time yet again, but I'm not going to jump back 200 years. I just wanted to remind you of the Botanic cottage that was left behind at the perimeter of the Leith Garden. And it was still there almost 200 years later and it lay long forgotten in disrepair and was about to be demolished in 2008. So then, luckily, a campaign by local residents was launched to try and save it. The campaign was a great success, and the volunteers got down dirty, got together and helped with the careful dismantling of the building stone by stone. So the vision was to rebuild the Botanic Garden in the Botanic Cottage, I should say, in the garden, and to faithfully restore it to its original condition and decor. And it took years of planning and building warrants. And in the end, by 2016, so quite a long time later, it was finally opened in the garden. It now stands rather remarkably as both the oldest and the newest building on the site. And it also serves as the oldest surviving classroom of the Scottish Enlightenment. It's not only the building that's restored, but also some of its use. In the professor's room upstairs, where the Regis Keeper John Hope once taught Benjamin Rush, our current Regis Keeper, here you can see standing at the back, Simon Milne, once again, he's sharing his knowledge of conservation and climate action to a room of eager learners. So it's really nice to see this site being reused as it was so long ago. Now, that was 2016, and in the year 2020, we celebrated our 350th birthday. Or I should say, we started to celebrate before COVID gate-crashed the party. But with the garden, you can see in this image, just looking so beautiful, everything just standing kind of refreshed, renewed. You would have thought it was probably time to slow down and take a break. But no. In 2021, work begins on the biggest project of the garden's history, the Edinburgh biomes. Our iconic palm houses looking splendid from afar, but when you get up close, we could see how desperately they were needing repaired. And so began the full restoration of the first of our world-class glass houses. Our world-class glass houses, I get that mixed up. So it was a huge task. You can imagine emptying these two historic glass houses. We wanted to try and save as many plants as we could. And believe me, maneuvering a 7,000-pound palm tree in a tight space, trying not to break any of the sandstone floors, was a lot of pressure. But we did it and left this incredible building empty for the first time in almost 170 years, saving almost all the plants in the process. Work is now underway to restore the stone. So this brings us full circle back to the sandstone story. The ironwork also is in really bad shape, and we have to replace every single pane of glass across both the structures. And just bear in mind, every pane of glass is unique. They're not manufactured in a factory when they were built. They were all cut by hand. So that means that every single pane of glass has to have its own template and has to be created individually by some historic restorers. So I already mentioned that the Craigleith quarry had closed in 1995, and you can see these stonemason masters pushing back this 1-ton piece of stone back into place. But in finding a sandstone that closely matched to be able to do these repairs, stonemasons had to turn to a nearby quarry because Craigleith was closed, and it was in the north of England. So it turned out to be a very good match. But that quarry opened a lot later than this was built. So what we discovered was this very stone from the new quarry, which happened to be a very good match to our palm house, also happens to be the same sandstone that they used to repair the buildings all around Edinburgh, which we know were made of Craigleith sandstone. So I have all of my evidence gathered. Now, I hope you'll agree, there's almost no question that the first of our palm houses was indeed built with Craigleith sandstone. I've never been so interested in sandstone my whole life. I hope that has been enjoyable for all of you. But that's it. I rest my case. And it brings us right up to today, to 2024. So with this huge project that's ongoing just now, and it is a long project, I mean, it's probably got an ultimate end date of about the year 2030. And in the meantime, we've just launched a public campaign to help save the palm houses. What was originally about 2 million, very, very loose estimate. When we started to get the thorough surveys done, and we saw how poor the condition of the 2 palm houses was, that estimate has escalated considerably. So we're really looking out for all our supporters to help us get there. And I do want to make mention, by the way, of our American friends of the Botanics Foundation, who are also helping a great deal. So a special thank you to anyone in the audience who happens to be a member of the Friends of the Botanics Foundation in America, and who has contributed. It's a huge thank you. And thank you finally to everybody for coming along today and listening to me. And I really look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, thank you, Sadie, so much. That was wonderfully interesting. Before we get to your questions, there are 2 programs that I'd like to mention. On August 6th, we have an online lecture in our American Inspiration series with author Julie Satow, who will be talking about her new book, When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion. And then on September 6th, I will be hosting Martin Williams for an online presentation about his new book, The King is Dead, Long Live the King, Majesty and Modernity in Edwardian Britain. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we will answer as many as we can in the time provided. And I'm going to start off by saying Leslie has told us that the Cape of Good Hope is indeed in Africa. Somebody has asked, where in the garden is the tree fossil displayed?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, thanks very much, Leslie. I just had a moment of panic there when I got the wrong.
We all have had that. We've all been there.
Now, the fossil tree actually was right outside the glass houses, very close to the palm houses that are now being restored. Because of the restoration, they are right now sitting in our nursery site, separated onto pallets, so they're in big chunks. But the vision is, when the restoration is complete, that they will be put on display yet again outside of the palm houses. And sort of they're great because it starts the story of plant evolution. I mean, going back 330 million years is certainly a good starting point of a timeline, I'd say.
Well, very neatly, Rhonda has just asked, where are the palms being stored while the house is being rebuilt?
Yeah, so this is my constant struggle right now, is where and how to store these plants. So we have one other structure. It's one of our more modern glass houses, which happens to be just tall enough to hold these plants. It's the only option. And so they're currently squeezed in amongst other plants into one of our other glass houses. And that's one of the reasons the whole process of this restoration will take so long, is because it's not just the 2 palm houses that I've talked about. We have a whole range of 1970s palm houses that also need restoration. And when we do those, it's a real kind of 3D chess game, moving the plants from place to place in order to fit everything in.
There's an awful lot of interest in this glass house. So Gary wants to know, does he understand that all the glass is going to be replaced, or is the old glass going to be reinstalled? And if it's replaced, will double pane be used to help with the heating?
Yeah, so great question. The glass house, all the glazing will be fully replaced. The old glass really isn't in good enough condition to be reused. And The other reason we want to replace is because modern glazing has a much better sort of threshold to keep heat in, which makes the whole structure much more sustainable. So is it double glazed? We're asked that a lot. Now, there's a type of glazing. It's not exactly like the classic double glazing where you have like a gap between two panes. It's more like a sandwich. So you get two panes of glass, and in the center, there's a film which cuts a little bit of UV light, which can scorch plants actually. But it also makes it much more safe in terms of its structural quality. So if there was ever a breakage, there'd be no shards of glass falling, which is currently a bit of a fear. You know, if we had any breakages, you could have shards of glass falling from a great height. And now with this safety glass, you kind of avoid that problem.
On that same subject, Rachel would like to know what will happen to the old glass.
So some of it is being ground down, and the idea would be to incorporate it into a concrete light structure that could actually be used in, you know, you can make it into a blocks and then be used in paving. So there's a nice kind of circular use of all the materials that we're pulling apart. Yeah.
Anne would like to know if the glass house was designed by a pupil of Paxton.
Now Paxton was a contemporary, not so if I remember correctly, the first of the palm houses built in 1834 stood only for 2 years as Europe's tallest, because it was actually Paxton's glasshouse at Chatsworth House that beat us 2 years later. So I think contemporary rather than student of. But I don't actually have to hand the name of the architect of that glasshouse.
And you can email, you'll see at the end here, we're going to give you Sadie's email, and you can email her directly if you'd like to know the architect.
Yeah, I can find that out. Yeah.
Here's a really interesting one. I've heard that AI has been and is being used in the renovation of Notre Dame Cathedral. Has AI been considered to create the templates for the glass panes?
Oh, that is interesting. Well, the short answer is no, because we've already done the templates now, and really, I mean, it's as far from AI as you could possibly imagine. It's literally thin pieces of ply that were, when each pane was taken out, it was just made at like a trace, and those were all cut to size, and they've all got a little bit like battleships, if anyone remembers that game, where you have like where you have like a lettering system and a letter and number sort of combo, so that you can find exactly where on the building that piece of glass or that template came from. But yeah, I think we're probably a little bit behind the curve in terms of AI for this project, unfortunately. Sounds really interesting though. I might look into that.
So what we're going to call the Botanic Cottage, did the pictures reveal that it was completely taken down, stone by stone, put aside, and then re-erected?
Exactly that. So it was taken down again in a similar sort of way, that each stone was noted for its exact location, and then piled up on pallets and stored again in our nursery where the fossil tree is currently. And it sat there for like 7 years before we were given permission to rebuild it. So it's a very authentic replica.
It's very cool. It's an amazing restoration. What is Edinburgh Biomes?
Yeah, so this is the name given to this huge restoration project. So that includes the full restoration of every element of those two palm houses. It will also include a brand new ground source heat pump energy center to make to reduce the use of fossil fuels to heat the glass houses. And furthermore, it's going to be so about 10 more huge display houses and 2 acres of research glass houses.
Goodness gracious, that's a lot.
Yeah, flattened and rebuilt, like brand new state-of-the-art research houses built. So it's a massive project.
Is there still any connection with the medical department at the University of Edinburgh and the garden?
Well, we still have really strong links with the University of Edinburgh. In fact, our PhDs often are based there, and we have a full master's course on plant taxonomy to link back to Carl Linnaeus and his.
Is that true? A whole
Yeah.
master's program? That's
Oh, yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah, so they have
Gosh.
this great program. So we teach the majority of it at Edinburgh. And and so I suppose loosely it very strongly we link to Edinburgh University, but loosely linking to medicine. If anyone was to be interested in medicinal herbs, then we have that good relationship. But I think in general, medicine has kind of lost touch a little bit with plants as medicine.
Oh gosh, yes, there's no doubt about that. Certainly I think you're more advanced in the UK than we are in the United States in that regard. Um, Last question. Do you happen to know anywhere in the USA where least stone was used in a famous building?
I was looking into that. I would love to know if there was. We know there was some shipped to the US, but where it might have been used is going to be hard to tell. I think the next step would be to find what dates was it shipped and do a bit of guesswork on where it might have been used. I mean, because of the timeline, it would have been East Coast. Maybe, I guess you could start digging. You could start chipping bits of stone off buildings in Washington, D.C. and see if you can get a good match.
Well,
Don't tell them.
that's what I was going to ask is, was it just a region? And you sort of more or less said that when you said the East Coast, which certainly makes the most sense. Um, I'm assuming based on what we just saw in the glass house, and from what I know about walking around the new town in Edinburgh, that this stone has sort of a gray tint to it. Is that correct?
When it dirties, yeah. I mean, yeah,
Shocking. Who would have thought that
I
coal would do
know.
that?
I know exactly.
Because
So,
I'm trying to think what it would look like in America, right? And it sounds like it might be lighter here.
mm,
We didn't have the coal fires the way you did
well,
in the
true.
cities.
Yeah. I mean, it does age. So when it's fresh, it's got a sort of peach tone.
Goodness,
But
really?
yeah, and so if you see, well, if anyone wants to look back at the slides, and you could be able to see the images of the palm house, even that new piece of stone
Oh, the
going
new
in.
piece they were installing. So that's the
Mm.
natural color. So that really was so wonderfully light. Wow.
Yeah, yeah,
Gosh, it really darkened over time in the city, didn't
yes.
it?
And it was meant
Goodness.
to be like it's got a very high quartz sort of content, and so very long lasting. And in fact, doing the restoration work's been interesting because the older of the two houses, which is the one we think was built from Craigleith stone, is actually in much better repair than the younger of the two houses, largely
Right.
because of the stone.
The stone, right?
Mhm.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of today's presentation. If you have any other questions, you can contact us at heritagetours@nehgs.org, or you can email Sadie directly at sbarber@rbe.org.uk. Thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you will have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay cool, and I hope to see you soon on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.